Hi, and welcome to myself, Steve Hayes, and Michael Darby as we talk to you about our Tea Time top tips. It's been a little while since we were in front of the camera. I think it was the end of 2022 that we last gave an update on industry events, things that are happening in the industry. When I say the industry, specifically the product approvals compliance industry, covering EMC, radio, safety and related matters. I think just a quick roundup to start with then on the two large events that we attend as an organisation, that being the TCB Council and the Red CA. TCB Council being the US Compliance Association and the Red CA being the European one. So Michael, you went to TCB Council at the end of April.
Yeah, I did.
A week event, and you were there for the duration. So what were the pertinent topics?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I was at the TCB Council workshop in Baltimore. It was my first time physically at the workshop since pre-COVID times. It's a hybrid event. It was good to be back there in Baltimore, surrounded by all the people for the live presentations. I definitely recommend going there if you can. We often have like a beginner's basics day on a Monday for anybody new to the industry. We find we're just repeating the same information over and over, and so we've created a kind of online school where a small number of us have recorded our training, and so new people to the industry can join the TCB Council and get access to that. And so we won't be holding the beginner's day on the Monday anymore. So the main workshop is the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. Normal format. Tuesday is a kind of international presentations. There was NIST, there was ISED Canada. I spoke about Radio Equipment Directive and things happening in Europe. And then Wednesday, we have the full day of training from the FCC. And then on the Thursday, there's more exciting industry things. There's a lot of talk about time average SAR, automotive or vehicle communications and global market access. But consistently, the Wednesday is the day that a lot of people go for to hear from the FCC, and the Tuesday morning to hear from ISED Canada. Those are the two big things. So what did we learn this year, or this April? Well, I think some of the important topics, obviously there was updates on all different types of technology, where we are with Wi-Fi 6E, Wi-Fi 7 in the Wi-Fi 6E band, things like that, 5G of course, and communication in vehicles like cellular vehicle to anything. But also of course there was a lot of time spent on the real basics, where the FCC and Canada really talk about the things that they see people getting wrong. Some of the things they talked about were really quite simple. For example, products being certified but not having the FCC ID markings on them. The FCC really made a big deal of this, that products are reaching the shores of the United States, they haven't got the right labeling on them, so they withhold them at customs. It turns out the products are certified, but the product doesn't have the FCC ID on the label. Or maybe the filing, the certification filing says that it's got an online user manual, but it's not easy to find. So these are simple mistakes that the manufacturer's making. Sometimes you have to wonder, does the manufacturer really understand the requirements? And maybe is that a fault during the certification process? Another thing that the FCC and Canada talked a lot about is a topic they've talked about the last 2 or 3 workshops. And speaking of top tips, my top tip is that if the FCC and Canada have raised a topic at more than one workshop already, so in this case 2 or 3 workshops, it's a big deal. Get it fixed, because otherwise they'll make it more strict for you. And that is the topic of making sure you test all the hardware variations of a product. If the USA authorization route, whether it's SDOC or certification, is based on testing. If you test a product, you can sell that product. If you have any kind of hardware variation, you test the hardware variation. There's nothing in the FCC rules or the Canadian standards that allows the manufacturer the flexibility to say, well, I've tested one very similar and I'm going to sell the one that I haven't tested based on my judgment. That doesn't exist in the rules, In fact, if you go looking for it in the rules, you'll stumble across the clauses which clearly state you can only sell non-tested variants if they are identical to the one you did test. So any component change. Canada even mentioned if you change component suppliers, you would be retesting. Of course, each manufacturer does their own thing. I always relate this to speed limits. Everybody breaks the speed limit, but that doesn't make it correct. So that was a big topic for the FCC and Canada, and a reminder, and they're really clamping down on this. So they're telling certification bodies we can't certify a range of models based on testing of only a subset of those models, and they'll be looking closely at that and seeing internal photographs and parts lists to check that the products are all identical. Another hot topic, RF exposure keeps coming back as a hot topic. The FCC's new guidance still isn't a published guidance yet. They're still working on how to include RF exposure on the non-transmitter emissions. That's EMC spurious emissions, for example. That carries on. Another hot topic is another KDB, is the one on modular approvals. KDB 996369. It's the radio module KDB, and it's in draft status. The FCC has a modular committee, or the TCB Council, should I say, has a modular committee that we work with the FCC. I chair that committee, and we've been working hard to submit our comments to the FCC and Canada on those changes. Probably the biggest impacts for module manufacturers will be those making cellular user equipment modules and having to test with their antennas. And probably the biggest impact to people installing modules will just be having to really show the detail of checking their tests. The FCC and Canada have a concern that people aren't really doing that correctly. Of course, they talked about audit surveillance testing. As I hope all manufacturers know, if you test and certify a radio product for the USA or Canada, you always have to keep a sample back in case it gets called in for audit surveillance testing. And it has to be a production sample, not the one that was originally tested. So I guess those were the main topics covered, except probably one of the big topics was the covered list, or the equipment that you simply can't certify with the USA at the moment. This is typically IT and surveillance equipment, specifically from 5 companies that have been identified by the USA, by the FCC, and any company affiliated or linked to those 5 manufacturers. We simply can't test or certify, test them of course, but we simply can't certify those products for the FCC at this time. And so any certification, there has to be 3 cover letters. A cover letter from the manufacturer to declare that it's not that type of equipment, a cover letter to declare that it's not manufactured by one of those manufacturers or an affiliated company, and then a cover letter from a company in the USA who agrees to legally accept legal papers on behalf of the manufacturer if the FCC's lawyers or the US government's lawyers want to serve those legal papers to the manufacturer. So those were really the top topics, I would say, at the TCB Council workshop. That's 3 days summarised, and even then I wish I could have done it quicker. So yeah, that was Baltimore, and that
Very
was
good.
the summary there.
Yeah, excellent. And then it wasn't that long until the REDCA meeting for Europe. So for those that aren't familiar, REDCA is an acronym, Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association. And like TCB Council, meets twice a year. And the REDCA meeting this spring was held in Brussels, and it covers a couple of days. Normally goes hand in hand with the EU ANB, so the EMC equivalent of the REDCA. Michael, you attended that in person. I attended it online. I think it was a record number actually of as a hybrid meeting. I think probably a couple of hundred people attended. Combination of manufacturers, test organisations, certification organisations like us as Element, and then regulators as well. Let's go through a couple of those topics then. Do you want to pull some of those points out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the fact that so many people are attending the meeting now is an example of how it's not getting more simple. You'd think that everybody knows what a radio product is now. Radios have existed for years. We've had years to write harmonized standards. It should be simple. There should be no need for a meeting. But of course, that's not the case. More and more people are radio connecting their products, which becomes quite a complicated topic. But also, in Europe, we have some complications. For example, on the official journal of harmonized standards, we see strange little restrictions appearing next to some of the standards. And of course, we have the impending implementation of cybersecurity requirements. Probably the hot topic at the REDCA was cybersecurity. Originally, cybersecurity was supposed to come in on the 1st of August 2024, and the cyber standards were expected to be completed by the end of 2022. Well, the standards are running late, no big surprise there, and so the standards are now expected to be delivered in June 2023, and then the implementation date of the RED cyber requirements would be delayed a year until the 1st of August 2025. So we talked a lot about the standard and the standard development, but I think the delay in the beginning of the process was a big topic. Anybody looking online for Radio Equipment Directive notified bodies will notice that some notified bodies have already started to get listed. That doesn't really mean that those are the notified bodies that can do it and the other notified bodies can't. There really is an example of how quick some countries are at listing notified bodies, whereas other countries are a little bit slower. There's a lot of notified bodies that have the cyber capabilities, ourselves included at Element, but some countries are finding it harder to get the listing. It doesn't really matter because the notified body can't issue a legal certificate to the RED until August 2025 anyway. They could issue a certificate now, but it wouldn't be a valid document until August 2025, by which time it would certainly have expired because the known state of the art will have changed by that time. So yeah, the cybersecurity standard and the delay to the timeline was a big topic. And then probably secondly was that whole thing of restrictions on the official journal, tolerances, measurement uncertainties. Steve, you've been in this industry 35 years. Do you immediately know the difference between a tolerance and a measurement uncertainty?
Yeah.
And how are people new to the industry supposed to understand these little nuances?
Yeah, and actually it was a good debate that we had. For those that listened to the previous session that we did here, we were talking about the official journal at that time had just been updated and for the first time introduced these restrictions that you were just talking about. And the whole industry was sort of left a little bit perplexed as to what does that really mean? And so in between those two REDCA meetings, I think the Commission's gone away, done a bit of head scratching, consulted with industry and other regulators, and was able to come back to this meeting and provide a little bit more clarity in the meeting as we debated it and got really down to the nub of the issue, which is really, what do we mean around tolerances and measurement uncertainty itself? And separating and understanding the difference between those two things, which I think a lot of test and certifications organisations probably understood, but didn't quite understand the interpretation that the Commission had. So I think over that period that the Commission was involved, we got to the point where actually what we thought were proper restrictions in harmonised standards. I remember we were talking about radiated immunity previously and thinking the way that you calibrate the field for radiated immunity would mean that it was not harmonised and therefore there would be a restriction. But actually we've come away from that thinking, do you know what, I think radiated immunity could be considered to be properly harmonised. The tolerance issue isn't such the deal that we thought it was, and yeah, got a much better understanding of that. I don't know if you want to add something to it.
Yeah, I would agree, really. The radiated immunity, that looked like a classic candidate for having a tolerance, because for anybody who's been unfortunate enough to spend hours of their lives calibrating a radiated immunity chamber, the field gets set up for example, at 3 volts per meter, but you're allowed a tolerance, 3 volts per meter or up to 6 dB or higher, and then even actually a little bit more above that. But it was made clear to us at this meeting, well, that's part of the test setup and it's fixed. And then the standard doesn't modify that. And so a tolerance would be if the standard allows a test with variations. So for example, if a test said put a clamp onto a cable and the clamp could go anywhere from right up against the port until 1 meter away, that would be a variation where one lab could do it one way or one lab could do it another way. That wouldn't be okay. I don't know what it means with regard to standards that have things like you could test on an open area test site or a semi-anechoic chamber. Really, ETSI and CENELEC are being pushed to make sure there's only one way of testing for the standard to be harmonized. So good news in some sense, radiated immunity, you could argue that you do have presumption of conformity for that test. Still a bit unclear though on the test site issue. And the difference between tolerances and measurement uncertainties. Measurement uncertainty isn't really a tolerance, it's the lab checking that their measurements are accurate enough that they can then go and do the test. And you check your measurement uncertainties to a point where you can say, I have confidence that my measurement is accurate enough. Once I've established that, let's go and do a test. Whereas a tolerance is more like, let's go and do a test, and the test allows some variation. That's a different thing.
So, I mean, that discussion was born out of an input from the Commission representative himself in the meeting. Other topics that came out as a result of that, radio in vehicles was one of them.
Yeah.
That's been a topic that you've heard us both talk about previously. TGN 33 as it's referred to, TGN Technical Guidance Note, which is produced when there is some ambiguity as to what the requirements are, either in, not necessarily from a regulatory point of view, but just making sure that there's consistency between notified bodies and test labs. On that particular topic, I think the Commission now well understand the issues that the radio industry has when they design and certify product for use in a vehicle. And the Commission actually has now gone away and had a think about that. There was, after the Red CA, there was a regulators meeting, the radio expert group of the Radio Equipment Directive, and the Commission actually inputted a paper into that forum which would seek the guide for the Radio Equipment Directive updated so they provided some further clarification. Essentially, the argument, as you've heard us talk about previously, is really around who takes responsibility when the radio equipment is installed into the vehicle. Is it the, if you like, the module manufacturer, which we call radio equipment in its own right, or is it the vehicle manufacturer as they integrate it? And then how do they integrate it? Do they modify the product in any way, which varies from the way that it was originally tested, or the environment might be different, the way that they're using it might be different. And so the Commission's issued this document. We lead the work in the Red CA, if you like, debating the topic, and we're currently at the state where we're reviewing that input document and we're going to feed back to the Commission our industry views on its content such that the guide would get updated accordingly.
Yeah. And Steve, I believe you're the chair or the author of that Technical Guidance Note 33, although it's an industry document. You're convenient, so busy times for you, I'd imagine.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been working on this for quite a few years actually, but based on this latest input, my plan is to convene another meeting of the working group itself where we can debate this, and hopefully we'll bring this particular topic to a conclusion and then remove that ambiguity for the industry so it's clear for everybody what we need to do.
Yeah. And the European Commission plans to update the Red Guide this year, I think, as you mentioned, and so things like radio modules or radios into vehicles and things like that, I'm sure there'll be more clearly described. And of course, cybersecurity, I'm sure, will be included in that new version of the Red Guide.
Other topics we talked about REDCA. Well, there's standing items on the agenda that we always talk about. So we get input from the European Communications Office, CEPT. I think there was just a number of updates on new studies that they're doing, decisions that have been made that cover new types of technology. Certainly there's more work being done at high frequency given the use of the millimetre wave bands in Europe. Then ETSI, they did an update.
Good updates from ETSI. They talked about the EN 301-489 series of standards. This is EMC on radio. Some of you may have noticed, if any of you use non-radio products, if such a thing still exists, an old version of EN 301 489-1, old version 1.9.2 or something, is still on the official journal of the EMC directive. Hopefully nobody's using that old version, but they plan to withdraw that from the EMC directive soon to eliminate any confusion. Good stuff.
ADCO, they gave us an update. ADCO is, if you like, the police for the Radio Equipment Directive, a combination of all the market surveillance authorities. They presented the work that they've been doing and also highlighted future campaigns.
Yeah, one of the things that they said they're always looking at things like wireless LAN because often the manufacturer allows the user to make some settings in the 5 gigahertz wireless LAN with the possibility of putting them into non-compliant modes like turning off DFS. And that leads on to a broader topic that ADCO, or the Market Surveillance Group, said they're looking closely at any types of radio where the manufacturer allows the user to select settings, whether that's literally going into a menu and select settings, or whether it's through what's called a country code by saying, well, I'm in Europe, so bring on the European ones. But then in Europe they could go, well, actually, if I select a non-European band, then that it allows me to do that. And so obviously that means then that a CE mark product in Europe can be put into a non-compliant mode by a user who isn't legally responsible for the product, and the manufacturer is. And so market surveillance are looking closely at that to make sure that manufacturers, if you're CE marking a product for the EU, it works on the EU bands, not it doesn't allow users to switch on non-compliant modes or turn off critical features such as DFS.
CISPRA update. I always give an update on the work of CISPRA, this meeting was no different. There's always updates going on in the standards world. CISPRA are writing the emission standards, whereas TC77, a different subcommittee of the IEC, typically write the immunity or below 9 kilohertz standards. Lots of work going on there. So we've got CISPRA 32 that's being updated at the moment. That's the standard that covers all multimedia equipment. It used to be information technology, and then there was a separate standard for audio and visual equipment. And I can't remember how many years ago now, but those two standards were combined into this CISPRA 32 that covers all of that type of product, multimedia equipment. Lots of updates coming along for that. Some are still being debated, but the inclusion of wireless power transfer, for example, in multimedia equipment, some removal of sort of general miscellaneous items, like how to do testing above 1 gigahertz, for example. There's a slight discrepancy between what CISPRA 32 requires and the generic standard, so coming into some alignment on that. High frequency LISNs or artificial mains networks, the use of those, and just a general number of updates on that side. On household side, so CISPRA 14, they recently actually updated their standards, but they've immediately started on new items. Partly because if you think about household now, it's gone from something that's historically pretty low tech, you know, toasters and kettles, those sorts of things, to really high tech devices. You know, if we think about IoT type of infrastructure.
Toasters and kettles.
Yeah, there you go. Then we were talking about radiated immunity a short while ago there, and the de facto radiated immunity standard is IEC 61000-4-3. That over the years has been extended to now go up to 6 gigahertz. But clearly there are communications that operate above 6 gigahertz, and therefore the question is that standard still fit for purpose, or shall it be updated to cover this higher frequency band? And the answer is yes, it should, but rather than just sweeping the whole band, it's actually looking at it almost from a risk-based approach and saying, well, where are the threats coming from? And one of those threats is 5G new radio, NR. And interestingly, from an interference perspective, it fundamentally is different to the way that we historically think about radiated immunity, in so much as that the allocated frequency bands are much wider and they have significant power in, and therefore it's almost like a barrage test that needs to be done. So rather than one discrete frequency, it's actually a band of frequencies that will be transmitted simultaneously. And so that takes a lot of thinking about in terms of how do you do the testing, what the appropriate levels are going to be. So that will manifest itself in a new 61000-4 series standard in due course. On radiated immunity, we already have another one, which is close proximity fields. So this is really simulating your phone being used in close proximity to a laptop or a tablet or something like that, where the way that you launch the RF is slightly different. So lots of work being done on that to address the new and emerging threats that we see coming along. Actually, I mean, just going back to the Red CA, what we've agreed in future meetings is that I'll do an update on the immunity as well as the emission side, because it was more focused just on emissions up to this point.
Yeah. Good times.
Yeah, that was Red CA.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then before you know it, here we are, getting ready to go on holiday, and just finishing up some things. I guess other things I'm involved in at the moment, I've got still working on the ETSI document for risk assessments. There's actually 2 separate ETSI documents. One of them is all about the manufacturer's risk assessment for Article 3.1B and 3.2, that's the EMC and the radio. And then the other one is Article 3.3 cybersecurity, and I'm involved in both of those. And then I'm having calls with the FCC and the other members of the TCB Council board on the radio module KDB input and comments. So yeah, that's probably my time taking me right up to holiday time.
Great stuff. Okay. Thanks for tuning in, listening to us, and once the industry events have taken place in the autumn or fall of this year, we'll be sure to be back here giving you an update and letting you know what the hot topics are in the industry. In the meantime, have a great summer, and we'll speak to you then. Thank you.